I don't know if you know this or not, but cantors often respond to life through song. I didn't know. I didn't think so. Although many times these unconscious musical renderings are in Hebrew, sometimes they're not. Perhaps you may remember that interesting little song from the 1965 hit by the Lovin' Spoonfuls called, "Did You Ever Have to Make Up Your Mind?" Do you remember it? Did you ever have to make up your mind? Pick up on one and leave the other behind. It's not often easy, it's not often kind. Did you ever have to make up your mind? Sort of kind of begin to sound familiar to some of you. Okay, good. All right. I needed the backup band to go with that. All right. Well, although the song spoke of having to decide between two lovers, I've often found myself humming that opening bars of that song, only to discover that I'm in the middle of a situation where I've got to choose between doing something or just sitting quietly waiting for things to change in such a way that I can finally make up my mind. That's what the song is all about. That's what this Torah portion is all about this week, and it reminds me of making choices. And here's what I mean. This week, the Jewish community has been involved in the portion called Shalach Lecha. It comes from the book of Numbers, and opens with God's command to Moses to designate one prominent leader from each of the 12 tribes and send them into the promised land as advanced scouts to gather facts about the land, the cities, and the people as they prepare to enter. Of course, that's biblical for invade, but to enter the land. It is interesting that this same story is repeated in the opening chapter of Deuteronomy. Unlike the story in this week's portion, the version we read in Deuteronomy states that the people, not God, initiates the call. It is the people that called out to Moses in Deuteronomy to send the scouts into the land. Well, on the face of it, this difference in the two stories probably doesn't matter that much. However, no matter who thought of it, sending a representative from each tribe to scout out the land, perhaps even to establish some kind of initial contact with the inhabitants, makes perfectly good sense. But that's not how the early rabbis saw it. They read the two stories as one. For them, the Israelites were a reluctant group who couldn't make up their minds to stay in the protective cocoon of a life in the wilderness or risk a life of complete freedom and responsibility in the promised land. They were reluctant to leave the life they knew for a new life filled with change and uncertainty. Sounds familiar, right? It's not hard to understand, really. They went from the restrictions and hardships of slavery to suddenly bearing the full responsibility for their lives. For us, the choice would be simple. Yes, let's enter the land. But not so for the Israelites. They were faced with a tough decision, and they were scared. So you might ask, how do we know that? Well, the Torah doesn't go into a lot of detail at this point, but we do have a detailed account of every rebellion, every whimpering, every gripe that the Israelites had, and they had plenty. When faced with adversity, they would cry out, "Why have you brought us into this desert only to die? We would have been better off staying in Egypt as slaves." You can almost hear that would go with it. What they forget is that their life is so hard and miserable that they fled Egypt en masse without even a glance backwards. So, if their memory of past slavery was distorted, what was their perspective of life in the wilderness? Well, according to tradition, this time in the wilderness was seen as a time of direct spiritual connection with God. And how? Well, according to one tradition, all of the physical needs of the Israelites was provided by God. Food and shelter was provided by God, as with their clothing as well, which, according to rabbinic legend, never wore out. And most important of all, protection. All of this came from God. What was left for the Israelites to do to fill their days? Well, besides the occasional mass migration, for the most part, their days were pretty sedentary. They gathered manna in the mornings, according to tradition, and then spent the remainder of the day in prayer. It was like one long spiritual prayer fest, according to one rabbinic tradition anyway. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the chief rabbi in Great Britain, makes this connection. Rabbi Sachs writes that the Israelites were reluctant to leave the security of God's protective presence and enter into the hard reality that life in the real world held for them. So they did what many of us do when we are faced with the challenge of making tough choices. We turn to someone else and say, "You do it for me." They turned to Moses, in this case, and said, "Moses, you decide." So what does life in the real world mean? It means taking on responsibilities and accepting the consequences for the decisions we make in our own lives. Someone struggling with a drug addiction understands this all too well. The hard reality of the pain of addiction and withdrawal, along with the unrealistic perception that life will be better if they had the next fix. That's what drives them. And family and friends? Well, it seems the more they do to help, the deeper the addict falls into the addiction. Sometimes the choice we have to make is one that says, "I will not enable this addiction any longer." That can be one of the most painful decisions a parent can make. But it is important to remember when faced with difficult decisions that each of us is part of a larger community, a larger family, if you will. By immersing ourselves in the lives of our community, we also experience the communal joys and sorrows. By sharing, we gain strength from one another, just as we have opportunities to provide strength and comfort to others. But we have to choose to do that. Is that an easy thing to do? Well, most of the time I think it is. I mean, who doesn't want to celebrate, right? But that visiting the sick, comforting the bereaved, helping the financially stricken, the social outcasts, the marginalized members of the community, well, that can be just a bit too messy and too personal. And yet, we know that we have a divine obligation to do so. That's what a mitzvah is all about. So the next time you hear that song, did you ever have to make up your mind? Maybe it will help you as well when you find yourself having to make your own tough decisions. Shabbat Shalom. Good Shabbos.